Good morning, and thank you for joining us today for another recording of the Smart Snippets for Synthetic Surfaces. I'm joined today by Jarrod Hill, who we work with at SPORTENG for all of our synthetic sport surfaces. Good morning, Jarrod, and thank you for joining us.
Hi, Martin. Thank you for having me.
So today, everybody, we're going to talk about the importance of how you prepare the ground and understand the field of play before you even turn the sod. So Jarrod, you've done a lot of this, both for natural surfaces, hybrid, hard surfaces, and synthetics. Can you just talk us through the field when a client comes to us and says, right, okay, we want to build something on it, say a synthetic field. What are the sort of things that we need to know about for the surface before we even start planning, before we design anything?
Yeah, no, I think you hit the nail on the head. It's knowing everything about the site, because every project that has ever gone wrong is around that I've been involved in is when we don't know enough around the site. So there's been a latent condition that we didn't know, or something has reared its head up that was different to what we thought was happening. So really understanding the site really helps minimize the risk to a project, and it gives you some clarity around the design, but also the project costs. So it really is important to understand everything about the site at the start of the project, whether it's through a design and construct delivery or a full design and tender process. It's understanding everything is critical.
I agree wholeheartedly, and I think that the sorts of things we're talking about here is both above the ground and below the ground, isn't it? So the type of things above the ground may include floodplain overlays, it may look at trees in the area. Under the ground, what sorts of things are we looking at there?
Yeah, well, you said above the ground, you hit overlays, the terrain, any other obstacles, trees that cannot be removed. So understanding whether we can cut down a tree to allow the footprint. Beneath the grounds, you don't know what's beneath the ground until you start excavating it. So it's the condition of the subgrade material. So whether the soils are reactive, whether there's engineered fill, uncontrolled fill, natural soils, was it an old landfill? These things really dictate the outcome of the pavement design and can really have some significant costs on the project. Because unlike natural turf, where if the ground moves a little, you can rectify that through a top dressing regime. When you're working in the realm of synthetics, you don't want it to move. So you want it to be rock hard, level all year round, regardless of the temperature or the thermal conditions. So it's really imperative to make sure you get that, understand the ground and design it accordingly.
Now, you talked before about the different contract types between detailed design, design and construct, and hybrids in between that I know that both of us use. Now, when we do a D&C, I've seen quite a few contracts, tenders go out that just says we want a FIFA quality pitch and leave the rest of the tenders. I think that's quite dangerous for a council and opens themselves up to a lot of risk because it doesn't define the pavement type. It doesn't turn around and say what's around the site, what's wrong with the site, what's underneath the ground. So you put a lot of the risk on the contractor or the tenderer, which means they'll load the price because they've got to take all the risk. Is your view the same?
Yeah, no, it is. I mean, you risk. How you deliver a project is often around where that transfer of risk sits. So if you're doing a traditional full design package, the risk sits client side with their engaged consultants. When you typically move it across to a D&C type arrangement, you're moving that risk obviously over to the contractor, which, regardless of where the risk sits in regards to site investigation works, the cost is still should be there either way. So doing it up front prior to determining which way you go with the project, you're still going to be spending the same amount on a geotech investigation and soil contamination survey. So it's better off to know that information up front at the start of a project, so you know whether it's going to be a feasible project and to remove those surprises that could happen in a D&C environment. So not saying that D&C is not the right way to go, but regardless of which way you cut it, trying to identify the risks up front helps you to understand the financial costs of that project.
Yeah, I agree. And you start touching now on some of the things we actually use, some of the techniques. Obviously, for site services, as dial before you dig, you talk about the geotech environmental assessment. Can you just explain what you would expect to see on those type of initiatives and assessments for the site?
Yeah, from a geotechnical perspective, you're just trying to determine the suitability of the soils to build on. Ideally, you'd love it to be a nice, rich clay that is not reactive, that can compact up nice and hard, and you've got a base that won't move. But 9 times out of 10, it's not the case, because if the grounds were any good, they'd be putting buildings on it. So we're generally, sports fields are built on ground that has been an old landfill or an uncontrolled dumping ground. So trying to understand what that is through a really effective geotechnical investigation. If you can, test pits are ideal, because you're digging larger areas and getting much greater sample sizes. Boreholes are effective, but again, it's a needle in a haystack at some time. So doing an effective and efficient coverage of that geotechnical investigation gives you a good understanding of that soils. And then you've got the soil contamination testing to understand, if you do have to dig material and dispose it off-site, is there going to be issues with the cost associated with disposing that material off-site? Level and feature survey, self-explanatory, try and understand the terrain. Are there any services that are unknown that can be identified from the surface, and those type of things. So, and then understanding, are there any overlays around the site through working with the various Victorian government associations to understand flood overlays and other building overlay requirements.
And we talk about the geotech and doing boreholes, and over our years, we've seen everybody do from 2 boreholes for an 8,500 square up to 20 or 30. Now, my view is that should be dictated by what you already know of the site. So if you know in one area there's some contamination or there's some movement, you would do more boreholes. But on a general field, what would be the right number of boreholes, do you think, to do for a typical 8,500 square meter field?
Yeah, listen, I mean, the more the merrier, but obviously we can't rip it all up through having excessive amount of boreholes. You've got to appreciate that the majority of the cost is getting the drilling rig out there. So that's a lot of your upfront cost, is actually getting the rig out there to actually do the tests. The difference between probably 4 boreholes and 6 or 8, the cost is probably negligible. So I would prefer to see something closer to 6 to 8 as a minimum on a typical 8,000 square meters. 2 and 4 is just insufficient. But as you alluded to, looking at the history of the site, understanding if half the site was a landfill and the other half of the site was natural, you can sometimes walk the site and see if you can sort of get a feel for whether it was a slope site and half of it's been undercut and half of it's now under fill, and you can start being a bit more targeted in that geotechnical investigation. So doing the research around the history of the site beforehand helps really dictate a detailed site investigation.
And I think all of this has given us information so that we can design a pavement that's going to last. A pavement that's going to last, that the surface sits on for at least 20 years. Now, we've seen some tenders over the years which only have a 10-year life expectancy. Well, when the surface could last 12 years and the shock pad is for 25 to 30 years, that seems to be false saving of income or costs just to get something out as a D&C nice and quick. So what we would always recommend is that the pavement basis for 20 years is a minimum, and that we have the right geotech and the environmental assessment to do one thing, allow us to be able to design the base properly, but secondly, to make sure that everyone who's tendering on it has the same information and don't make assumptions. Because what happens then is the council then gets huge variation orders and claims which are well substantiated because they haven't given the contractors or the tenderers adequate information to bid against. So we would recommend that the councils or the sports actually take a little bit of time, and we're only talking here of another 3 or 4 weeks, isn't it, Jarrod?
Yes.
To get all of that background.
Yeah, and there's a real critical conversation around how you design pavements, and I like to think of it as 2 things. You've got your subgrade, so there's potentially subgrade remediation, so you need to get your subgrade right, and then once you've got that right, then you look at the pavement. Sometimes there is a blurring between the lines where the pavement design and the subgrade remediation become intertwined, and that's fine in some instances. But I'm a firm believer of getting the subgrade right, fix your subgrade. Once you've got your subgrade right, then you look at your pavement design to suit that.
Yeah, and I think we've seen lots of examples in Victoria around Melbourne when 10 years ago so many fields were put in with a very shallow pavements and unreactable clay. And for the last decade, we've been seeing the consequences of those where the pavement hasn't lasted. And the second consequence of that is when they put the next field surface down, they're going to have to almost dig up the pavement base and start from scratch again. So it's really important that you get it right first time.
Yes.
And you should be looking for 20 years plus, shouldn't we?
Yeah, and you hit the nail on the head. Get it right first time, because as you alluded to, it's very difficult to rectify these things once they're built. If it starts to move, the issue is because the subgrade's not right. So it's a significant rebuild when the time comes. So getting it right the first time is critical.
Yeah, thanks, Jarrod. And I really appreciate you sharing your insights with us today. Thank you very much.
Great, no worries. Thank you, Martin.